talk to you tonight about, well, kind of my background and, my history, and then also kind of forward it through why I feel like the future of food is revisiting the past. Not that we're revisiting the past, but we're looking to the past for the future of our food. And so, as it was said, I got my master's in history, so I have a historical background or a history background, but it kind of took me a long time to get to where I am today. So being on this stage is kind of funny because the amount of time I spent in my high school was very small. So this is a really embarrassing picture, but actually I have really good hair because that's senior year. And I had sophomore year decided to shave half of my head because I would say I was a troublemaker. My mom always called me creative, which is the sign of a really good mom because I was just trouble. And if my son did half the stuff I did, I get reminded all the time. My mom says, "How did you end up with your son?" Because I was not good. So, I had two things going for me when I was in high school. So I went to high school in Naperville North, which I hated. I hated being from Naperville. I hated being in the Midwest. I hated being in the suburbs. But I had a great mom. I had a great dad. And I had a great history teacher my senior year of high school who allowed me to take an AP European history class. I had no business being in this class because I think my sophomore year I got 3 Ds and an F in my class, in my grades. And so junior year I kind of like trudged along, but I was always really good in history. That was the one class I always at least got a B in. And so this teacher in particular I loved, and I talked my way into this class, and it was AP European history. And I fell in love with studying history, and I graduated with a 1.67 grade point. I know you can actually graduate with that, right? I know I see people like, no, that's true. I tried to find my old report card, but Julie, my business partner, who always is more sensible, was like, no, it's not necessary. And so when you graduate with a grade point like that, I'm a perpetual optimist. I thought, I'm going to apply to so many schools because my older brother was really smart and he got scholarships. And so I went on college tours with him, and all the schools were great. Like we went to Boulder, we went to Notre Dame. I was like, these are awesome. I'm going to apply to these schools. It's always good that I'm not really aware of like the obvious, that I had no business applying. So my dad was like, well, I think that you could apply to the schools nearby there, but maybe not those schools. And so I applied, I think, to 14 schools, and I got rejected, a solid rejection from 12. And I'm talking University of Wyoming, University of Kansas, Colorado State. That was like, I think I applied to College of the Atlantic, which was a school of 500 people, because I thought it'd be really cool to live on an island in Maine. I had no plan. Anyhow, my mom, again, because I was creative, she's like, you need to go to a 4-year liberal arts school. You need to do that. You're not done yet. I'm not fully baked, apparently, at that point. And so my mom, and a really good recommendation from my history teacher, got me into a small liberal arts school called St. Norbert. I didn't want to go there. I really didn't want to go there. I'd never heard of it. It was in Green Bay. Again, I'm in the Midwest, and I always felt like I was better than that. Not that there's anything wrong, but I just thought I was a coast person, east, west, not the Midwest. But nobody wanted me, so I went to St. Norbert, and I found my passion in history, and I loved history, and my minor was philosophy, so 2 super useful things to study. But I did really well. I was able to go overseas and study in Norway, got exposed to amazing bread and food, and I started kind of seeing that the world is bigger than my little bubble of Green Bay or Naperville, and my thoughts started to really emerge that maybe I'd go get my PhD or my master's in history because I wanted to teach. So I ended up going to University of Maine. It was the only school I applied to, so it worked out that I got in because I didn't have a backup plan. And while I was there, my first week, I was the youngest in the program, and I went to speak to my advisor all excited. I was like, I'm gonna come up with a thesis that's gonna change the world. I can't wait. And he looked at me, he'd been teaching for probably 30 years, Dr. Nadelhoff, and he said, there's nothing original, it's all revisionist. You'll look at something and you'll take your slant because you have a bias and you'll write it, and that's it. And in 20 years, someone will revisit that and change it. And I left and I was like, what? Like nothing's original with what I'm gonna do. And I really, like my bubble deflated. And, but I'd already taken out the college loans. I couldn't back out at this point. The check had been cashed and I'd already spent some of it. So I spent my first year just kind of getting through the program, going through, and I saw a flyer for historic preservation on the coast of Maine. And I thought, that sounds great. Like, that's what I'm gonna do. I'm gonna apply to this program and spend my summer restoring a house in Wiscasset, Maine. And it was through the Society for the Preservation of New England Antiquities, SPNEA, which I'm sure most of you know, is a very stuffy group. And everybody applying to this came from like really great colleges with great experience, and they'd been studying historic preservation. I think it was like Bob Vila's daughter was even on this program with me, because I knew nothing, but I was accepted into the program. I wrote a terrible essay, because I'm actually not a good writer, although I did write the cookbook with help. But I was accepted to this program, and I went and I spent time working on this house that really, it's very ugly. The society was really bummed it got donated to them. I shouldn't say that because it might be like, but they really didn't want it. But this woman had lived here, her whole family had lived here for 150 years, and they donated it because they wanted to make it a museum. And so our job was to go in and look at the beams and to tell when things were added on. And one of the ways you do that is you look for hand-hewn beams, and you see that that's been made with an axe, or you look if there's like a circular saw, because that dates it to the 1870s. So it's like putting together a puzzle. And basically when I was there, I realized everybody knew so much more than me, and I already felt behind, and I felt like the dumb one in the room, because I just was like, oh my gosh, do you see like this behind here? They're like, that's called like the Roman planer, and yes, that, you know, is nothing that exciting. And so I like to say that this is where the name Hewn came from, though. So I spent my master's learning about hewn beams, and excited when I found in this building like hand-hewn lath, which is what holds together plaster. And it's the name that stuck with me because it was an artisan building this house from 1803, and it was the original part of the house. And so my joke is like I spent like $30,000 to go to grad school to come up with a name for a business that I had no clue I was gonna do. I still think it's cheaper than business school, but and I just paid off those student loans this summer. So that was like exciting, it happens. So fast forward as I can do with a slideshow. I graduated with my master's in history, and I had so many job offers because I had my undergraduate in history, I had my master's in history, and it was like overwhelming because I didn't know what to do. And no, I ended up moving back with a U-Haul and a pregnant cat, and moved in with my parents and didn't know what to do. Literally, I mean, we all have our stories, so let's just say that I took a lot of jobs that were terrible, humiliating, because I felt like I was so much smarter than like being a temporary filing clerk, but I didn't know, you know, what to do. And I worked at a job then I moved out to Seattle with my now ex-partner and I got a job. I talked my way into a job as a software trainer. I literally didn't even have a computer. In grad school, I remember there was a thing called the internet that had come up, and this was in the late 90s. There was internet. And I remember thinking it was so freaky that I could do that. So I somehow talked my way in the early 2000s in Seattle to work at a technology company and as a trainer. And it was great because I got to travel, and you're in your 20s and you have a little bit of money. For me, a little bit is literally what I had, but I felt great. But September 11th happened, and I was in Tampa at that point, and I remember it happened, and it was so terrifying because I was by myself, and the world was imploding, and all of a sudden I was like, I hate this job. There was no flights flying anywhere, right? So I was stuck in Tampa, which I mean isn't a bad place to be, but when you're by yourself and everybody's scattered all around, I spent 2 weeks literally in a Hampton Inn by myself, every day, but I connected with a 85-year-old aunt that I really didn't know I had, and I'd go to her house and she had like frozen pesto in ice cube trays, and we'd spread that on Ritz crackers, and she'd just talk to me as if we were like living in the 70s. In hindsight, I think she might have been losing her memory, but it was really nice to spend time with her because I was so scared about what was happening, and it didn't seem to faze her. And I do think now that it was because she really wasn't as with it. Anyhow. So I was there really thinking, what am I going to do with my life? Like, I can't just keep doing this job. I hate it. And I had always loved cooking. My dad tried to encourage me in high school to go to culinary school, and I thought it was because he didn't want to spend the money on a college. He was a businessman, so he would have been smart to encourage me not to go to college. And I finally was like, I'm going to go to culinary school. That's what I'm going to do. And I thought, everything will just find its way. And so I went back to Seattle finally after 2 weeks being stuck in Tampa, not before a hurricane decided to come, and I had to actually drive from Tampa to Atlanta before the bridges there closed because of this hurricane that was coming. It was so crazy. And anyhow, there was a wait list at the culinary school, of course, so I had to like delay for a year. I get into the program, and I was so excited to be there. And it was the most magical place to go to culinary school. It was a community college, so it wasn't anything expensive, but it was a really amazing program. And for me, it's why I'm a huge supporter of community colleges, because they're where you learn the trades and vocation without taking on a ton of debt. And this school, I went for 2 years, a really intensive program. I had to dress like that every day, literally, and be that clean. That's never how I am in my real life, pre or post school or culinary school. But it taught me such great skills, and one of the things that it taught me I didn't study baking too, ironically, because I never do anything right the first time. I studied on the savory side because I thought I'm not good in math, I can't do baking because I'm not that exact, that baking is for people that are really scientific and really clean and really organized. And with savory, you add a dash here, you add a dash there. That's what I studied. So I studied 2 years, and I interned at an amazing French restaurant that had gotten a lot of awards. And one of the things this program taught me was working with farmers directly and sourcing locally. And this was something in the early 2000s that wasn't a big buzzword yet. But for us, it was part of our education. We had a farm, and we had a farm school we had to go to, and we really had to learn about seasonality. And so I left this program really committed to working with local farmers and working in restaurants and doing the great life of getting paid nothing and working in really cool places and thinking I was really cool. And now we're going to fast forward, as historians say, another decade. And I wanted to say a century, but the century had passed from my master's to culinary school. But so I was in Seattle, not really knowing what I was going to do because most restaurant jobs don't pay a lot. You don't make a lot of money. And then my ex-partner got offered a job here in Chicago, my now ex-partner. And so we moved back to Chicago. And what happened in between that, though, is I had a young son. I had a baby. We decided to have a baby. And he was born 2 months early. And that pretty much changed everything because right before, it was 6 months, or it was about 8 months before we moved back here, he was born. And he was born 2 months early, and every plan I had just kind of like went out the window because now I have this newborn who didn't show up on time, and I had too much to do, so it was so inconvenient. No, I was more just terrified. And then we moved back here, and I don't think I had recovered from him coming early, and I moved here I think I moved like in the late fall, and then winter hit. And my ex-partner was at work all day, and I was home with a young son. None of my family lived here anymore. And I think, now I don't have like big psychological words or psychology words, but I think I was depressed is what I would call it, because I just didn't know what to do with myself. I had been on this like journey of like me, doing all of this, and all of a sudden I'm home taking care of a 2-year-old, and I didn't have a lot of friends. I didn't know anybody. And as my mom is good about, and then also another big event happened. My son was just about 2, and my dad literally dropped dead of a heart attack. And just very abrupt, 62, and it was so bad that, I wasn't there, but my mom was, but I got a phone call. I kept getting a phone call. And I'm like, God, cell phones with older people are terrible because they just keep like butt dialing you. So finally, I'd pick it up. Hi, Mom, yes, click. Hi, Mom, yes, click. I'm like, oh man, I'm not gonna answer it. Finally, I pick it up and my mom says, Ellen, I'm doing chest compressions on your father, call your brothers. And I'm like, oh, okay, just let me know where you're gonna be. And she's like, the Irish, she's like, we're not gonna be going anywhere, just call your brothers. I'm like, okay. So my dad literally dropped dead. And I then, was just in a midst of figuring things out. And I went, we had to celebrate our first Christmas without my dad. And none of us really felt like eating. He was the big cook. And my mom got me a cookbook for my present, or a Christmas present. And it was an amazing baking book called Tartine. And if anyone's seen it or read it, it's amazing. And that pretty much changed the whole trajectory of my life, where I became obsessed with this cookbook. I think sometimes when you are depressed or lonely, or just have the time to just like let yourself be and not be like, what should I be doing? You just are. It's when you actually allow the most to come into your life. And I literally spent, I want to say, the first 6 months learning how to make bread. I missed the bread I had eaten on the West Coast, and I just became obsessed. I mean, all I wanted to do was like take care of Asher and make bread, take care of Asher, make bread, make and cook. And what happens though, when you become addicted to things, like any good addict, you have to become, a pusher. You have to become a dealer. And so I started to become a dealer through my son, which he was at Caravali, and I said to Asher, I'm like, hey, give this loaf of bread to, one of your friend's parents. And I might have done the sales myself, but I think he gave it to them. And people were like, this bread's amazing. And I was like, oh, would you like to join a bread club? I have a bread club. And from literally that, my bread club started. And it started spreading throughout Caravali and throughout Evanston. It was just weird. It was like this chain that started happening of people that started connecting, wanting to be in my bread club. And so once a week, I would bake a max of 100 loaves of bread out of my house, out of my little condo, and I would make it around Asher's schedule where he was sleeping or going to school. So it'd be like this hustle. And I'd load him up in the Burley and we'd bike to school and we'd hand out bread. And this went on for about 3 years I did this out of my house. And one of the things that was amazing was I was trying to source really good flour. And I thought it was because I was a home cook, I can't get access to any of this flour. And so I thought, if I maybe was in the baking business, I would be able to source from wholesalers, because we live in the farmland, we live in the Midwest. We've got to be surrounded by amazing farms, just like when I was in Seattle, I had access to really great farms. Basically now we fast forward, I spent 3 years working out of my home kitchen, and Julie Matthei, who's my now partner, she had talked to me about maybe opening a bakery. And I was like, that sounds like a lot of work. I'd have to actually be somewhere every day, as we talked about it more and more, I realized what's the alternative? My previous life, I'd spent so many years just unhappy with my jobs or hustling. I was like, this is an opportunity that I have to take. If it fails, whatever, it fails. But I don't also have an alternative, because I had over 100 customers and I was turning people away, and I didn't want to stop. And so in 2013, literally, Julie and I, we talked about it, and within 6 months we had the bakery open and going. And I think, again, some of the best decisions you ever make are ones you don't really think about too much, because then you wouldn't do it. And the intention of the bakery was always to be a community bakery where we were focused on our neighborhood. So we were focused on our suppliers and on our employees and on our customers. And that was it. I wanted to source the best possible ingredients. And now that I had this bakery, I thought, okay, I'm going to contact these wholesalers and find out what flour they have, because clearly there's going to be a lot of amazing grains that are just hidden to the average home cook in the Midwest. And what I found was there was no access to really good flour. When we started the bakery, I started using organic flour. We've always used organic flour, but we were importing it in from Utah. So it was grown in North Dakota, milled in Utah, and then shipped to us. And what I was really focused on was making the connections with the farmers. But how do you become friends with farmers? You know, it's like, it's huge land. Most of the people don't live in the houses. You know, and I'm always worried about getting shot, you know, because you hear about farmers and guns and, you know, people are protected. So I went to this event called the Good Food Festival in 2014, and some of you may have been there. It's an amazing festival, open to the public, and I went, and it's farmers that set up tables and they sell their products. And I saw this woman with this beautiful table of grains in her bags, and she was just sitting there selling bags of grain. And I went up to her and I was like, would you ever want to grow like some wheat varieties that I had read about? Because, you know, all of my history was not wasted. I actually love to read about different varieties of wheat, not really knowing that we weren't growing. I didn't know anything about wheat growing. I didn't even know we weren't growing different varieties of wheat. And I asked her if she'd be interested in growing some heritage varieties that I had read about. And she had like einkorn already, she had like a blue barley, she had different corn types. So she's like, yeah, sure, I would be interested in growing. And I spent a big chunk of time at the archives in Madison reading the old farm journals. I came up with a whole list of all of these awesome varieties that grew really well in our region in the early 1900s. And I thought, well, this will be a great list. We can at least maybe get 3 different varieties and start growing like they did back in the early 1900s. So I spoke to Andy and I said, here's my list that I have, and let me know which one you want. And she got back and she said, I can't get any of these. There's no seeds available for these. But what I do have is I got 1 kilo, which is 2.2 pounds of marquee wheat. And I was like, okay, well, I didn't research that at all. I don't know anything about marquee. And she's like, that's what we have. We're going to work with that. And so Andy, the first year, this is actually a picture on the left. It was 3 rows of 150 feet. That's what 1 kilo of seeds gets you, which is great if it's produce, but for farming, that's nothing. That's like not enough for us to do anything with. And on the right, you know, we brought the kids out, and those are strawberries. They don't care about wheat. They're picking strawberries. And so the first year in 2015, she planted this. And so with wheat, there's what's called a spring wheat, which you plant it in March or April, and then you harvest it in August. And so I was calling Andy because we were going to go out because we were going to harvest the wheat. And in my mind, harvesting the wheat meant that I go and I'll bring some beer from some of the breweries that we work with. I'll bring some bread, of course, and we'll sit out there because it's August. You know, it's like early August. It's really hot out there. And I called her and I said, Andy, so we're ready to come. Let me know if you need anything. She's like, bring scissors. And I was like ready to hang up and just be like, okay. And then finally I'm like, wait, what do I need the scissors for? She's like, well, we got to harvest the wheat. And I was like, what? Andy had a farm fire. Her barn had burned down. She'd been farming on this land since 1847, her family had. And her dad, I think, was 5th generation. She's the 6th generation farmer. And they had saved all of their old farming tools because they used to have to hand harvest. But it was completely destroyed. Literally, when we showed up, there were tractors that had been burned and melted down, and all of his antiques were gone. So literally, we could have been out there really cool, like harvesting, you know, like you see the Amish harvesting. But instead, we brought our scissors, and you can see in one of those, a guy holding scissors, and we had to walk the rows and hand harvest it. And it's a pretty amazing thing because well, first off, we're in shorts. Never go to a farm in shorts because you get eaten up with I don't even know what. And a guy who was from Iowa said it was farm spiders. I'm like, is that real? He's like, I don't know, that's just what we called it. But I didn't see spiders, but you get your legs shredded and you're sweating. It was horrible. But and this middle picture, the middle picture that you saw there, it's okay. The middle picture is a big storm coming. And the whole ride out, I was like, God, I hope that storm doesn't ruin our party. And I get out there and I said to Andy, I said, geez, that storm looked really terrible. What would happen if that came? And she's like, well, that would have been really terrible. We probably still would have been able to harvest, but if we had gotten any rain this week, the crop would have been gone. We would have lost it. And I just looked at her like, what? What do you, like, rain? Because it rains, it's summertime, right? And she said, Yeah, it probably would have most likely destroyed the crop this year because it can't rain during the certain point of when you're harvesting because you're trying to dry it. So a lot of farmers keep the wheat growing enough so that it dries down before they harvest it. So I just sat there and I thought, you're better off going to Vegas to gamble half the time than be a farmer. I mean, it's terrifying. So anyhow, but in a very stoic way, she's just like, yeah, we're glad it didn't rain. So that first year, we got from the 2.2 pounds, we yielded 30 pounds of seed. That's nothing. So I didn't make any bread with that at all. We saved all of that 30 pounds, and Andy cleaned it and threshed it, and then she planted 30 pounds year 2, and we got 300 pounds of grain. That's still nothing. I mean, we go through 300 pounds in like 2 hours at the bakery. And so then she planted 300 pounds, and this last year, 2017, she harvested 3,000 pounds. And so we got 500 pounds of marquee wheat. Now, the marquee, there's nothing really amazing about it in terms of a variety. It's a variety that actually was grown a lot in the like 1910 to about the 1940s it was grown. It was a natural hybrid between 2 old varieties. So it was a hard red Calcutta with oh gosh, why am I drawing a blank? I think with red Fife. And it was in farm journals that I had read about it because it was written up. It was a great milling flour and it was a great baking flour. But I had no clue what that meant because, you know, sometimes when you read old history or farm journals, like I always say, like if you're reading about like fashion, you're not going to replicate fashion from the early 1900s. And I was worried that our palates were so laden with sugar and salt that we wouldn't actually appreciate a wheat like this. But what I found this last year when we got 500 pounds to bake with is it was an amazing variety to bake with. And the miller that milled it for us, she actually in particular was like in love with the smell. She just like, it was the most fragrant and amazingly nutty smell coming off the mill as she milled this. So that leads me into, it's one thing to be growing older varieties of wheat, but the other problem that we have is, well, first, so there's just not a lot of variety, and I'll go more in depth in just a few more slides about the lack of diversity in wheat and why it's important. But so growing the crops is important. The second is actually the infrastructure of cleaning and milling the wheat. That's something that there hasn't been, I like to say, and I haven't found something to counter this, so that for the first time in 80 years, we have 2 stone mills in the state of Illinois. And that's significant because farmers historically growing wheat, when you drive by the farmlands here, most of those grains you see, it's not for human consumption. And most of it, it's either corn or soybean. And wheat is in there, but wheat normally is never taken to market in this area because there's just no money in conventional wheat. But they use it as a cover crop or a crop in their rotation. So farmers were not investing in the infrastructure of putting in a mill and cleaning facilities because no one was bringing their wheat to market. And so this man, Harold Wilkin, who's another 5th generation farmer, came to me because he had read a story about what Andy and I were doing. And actually a woman, an Evanston resident, brought him from, they had met at the farmer's market. If anyone has been Henry's farm, Henry's Organic. So Jill, Henry's sister, is the miller at this mill. And so it's a kind of tiny little network of people. So anyhow, Harold had come into my bakery, about 3 years ago with Jill and Tara Brockman. And they were like, would you have any interest in buying locally grown stone milled wheat? And it was like, I just looked at him, I'm like, I've been waiting for you guys to come. I thought you existed. And Harold said, well, we're looking at building some mills, and we've been growing organic wheat for probably about 12 years, and we're ready to put in a mill now. And so for me to have access to stone wheat, I should explain why that's important, because most of the flour that we have access to is roller mills. And so the way you think about that is it's a really highly industrialized way to process flour. So you get the wheat berry, and then you take the berry and it goes through these wheels. Essentially, think of big rollers that roll the grain down and break it and shatter it, and then it separates out into 3 different parts: the bran, the germ, and the endosperm. So white flour and then essentially whole wheat flour. And so roller mills, though, it's like you're getting like thousands of fields, and then they'll reconstitute the flour and put it all together. So their whole wheat is actually what they would envision whole wheat. It's not how it's been grown, where it's one berry milled down. So I like to say, think of like one cow getting broken down and you're eating the meat of one cow, right? That's a stone mill. Roller mills are, you're getting 1,000 cows and you're making ground beef with them, and that's what your flour is. So a stone mill is so much more nutritious because it's grinding the berry whole, and you're getting all those oils and all of the nutrients in your flour. Even if it's sifted out and you're getting more of a whiter flour, you're still getting all of that. So for us at the bakery, it was so important, and some of you were able to eat some of the stuff that we make at the bakery, and you'll notice it's a darker color, all of it, because everything we make has the bran and the germ in it. We're not using a highly processed white flour that's devoid of all of that. So having access, but the problem is that stone milled wheat goes rancid quicker. So you need to have a mill close to you that you can get your flour very quickly. And so Harold invested in this, and this is Harold in his field. So this is in the winter time, actually. And with the sun, it's beautiful, though he thinks he looks scary, like I said. So for us, using stone milled flour was super important. And from Janie's farm, we source now a significant amount of our heritage flours that we get, like different varieties. I won't bore you with those varieties, but it's in the cookbook too. And then so then another family found me, and I don't remember how these guys found me, but they're from Wisconsin. Farmers started reaching out to me because they had read an article, and then they had heard from their friend that there's this baker that's using different varieties of wheat, and you should contact her. So I started having different farmers come and like seek me out. And this is a really cool young family up in the Driftless region of Wisconsin, which is beautiful. I don't like to talk about it because I don't want it to become a trendy place, because someday I'll be able to buy land there, so it's not that cool. But it is beautiful. And this is them in their field of turkey red wheat, which is growing. So this is another variety that has an amazing background. So turkey red is the name of the wheat. It also could be called can red, a lot of names. A lot of wheat has like a bunch of different names, which leads to some confusion. But this is a heritage variety that actually 90% of Kansas was grown with turkey red. And it was brought over by the Mennonite farmers fleeing Tsarist Russia in like the 1870s. So they literally sewed the seeds into the hem of their clothing and went and relocated to Kansas. And this happens to be, we get a lot of great varieties of wheat from the Ukraine, from Turkey, from that whole region. The Crescent Belt is essentially, that region is where we've gotten a lot of our wheat varieties that grow really well in our country. And turkey red, Harold grows it too, and these people have to go and find farmers that have been growing this because these seeds have disappeared. So it's really special when you have a farmer that's been growing turkey red, even though he didn't have a market for it. He grew up because his grandparents and his parents grew it, and he just grows it. So the Webb Kings got access to it, and they grow it. They also grow for us a different variety of spelt, and they grow rye, and a variety called Red Fife, and I don't want to bore you with the names of it, but my point being that, and so, I'll just interject though, this bread in the middle, the Holmenkollen rye, this is going back to when I was in Norway. When I lived in Norway, I was a really poor student, and I didn't do my research and realize that Norway was a super expensive country to live in when you're a student. And so like literally I'd go to the store, and the only thing I could afford was really nutty bread like this, and I needed it to be, very filling. So I'd have that, and I'd have some of their really good butter, and then I'd put some cucumbers and red peppers and a Jarlsberg cheese slice, and that was like what I lived on. And I would buy beer. And the thing that was funny is it took me, I don't know, maybe like a month, because I would go in and I'd buy this one type of beer, and it was cheap. I was like, it's so cheap, I can't believe it. I thought I just found something magical. And finally I made some Norwegian friends, and they were like, why are you drinking non-alcoholic beer? I was like, oh. So it's, priced according to its alcohol content. So anyhow, So going and talking about the whole idea of diversity of grains. So for me at the bakery and for all the bakers that work for us and our customers, I hope that they believe, I know they believe in this because they come to us all the time. It's about increasing the biodiversity that we have. It's not just a matter of me getting stuck on Marquis or Turkey Red or Red Fife or any of these varieties. And that's why I don't like our customers to get hooked on one type, because for us, it's way more important that we continue to bring back the diversity of wheat. There is over 10,000 varieties of wheat that have been grown. One agronomist told me 100,000. I just feel like that's way too many, so I say 10,000, although they probably know more than I do. But and that diversity was strength. It used to be that if one field failed, one variety failed, another would grow without a problem. And so, but what we've been doing in this country with industrial farming is we've narrowed down the amount of varieties that we grow, and they are so reliant on synthetic inputs to grow that one of the things that people hear about is the gluten issue, right? Being gluten-free and gluten sensitive. Well, at our bakery, first off, it's the varieties, and then it's also the process of how we make our breads, in particular with a long fermentation. But I think if you start with the source of how the wheat is grown, that's probably more often where people are having problems, because I think your body's actually just reacting to the toxin. It's doing its job. And so, like, the way that modern wheat is harvested is important to go over, because I had no clue about the process until I started spending time with farmers. And so the conventional way of harvesting wheat, ready? They'll buy the seeds and they'll plant this type of seed, and they know already that it needs this amount of it'll put in the nitrate, they'll inject the fields essentially with all the fertilizer it needs. They'll give it, they'll spray it with insecticides, they'll spray herbicides, which is Roundup, to kill weeds. And so with conventional varieties of wheat, one of the things that's a big change is after World War II, well, after the war, they found a Japanese dwarf variety of wheat. So it would grow like this tall. And so what the modern American seed companies started doing was crossing this dwarf variety with some of our other varieties so that it would grow short. And the reason being because wheat, if it gets a windstorm, these heritage varieties grow tall. Some of them grow this tall, some of them grow this tall, and but they'll lodge. If a big windstorm comes, they'll tip over, so they're not as strong. So once they started crossing it with a dwarf variety, the wheat would grow about this tall, but the problem is that the weeds would compete with it. The tall varieties would block out the weed growth, and the wheat would be able to outcompete the weeds in most cases. But with the dwarf varieties, they couldn't. So that's why they started spraying herbicides into the fields to kill the weeds. And so the other thing that they do is 2 weeks before harvesting, they'll spray the fields with more herbicides, Roundup, because it helps dry the wheat before harvesting. And so then after 2 weeks, they harvest it. Now, the thing with wheat is they're not cleaning it and rinsing it. They're milling it, right? So you're just ingesting these chemicals. And that's what's conventional wheat. And that's why it's so devastating and so bad and on such a huge level. And the other thing is farming, you know, if we change how we grow our grains, we're talking millions and millions of acres, because it's such an economy of scale. Whereas, you know, it's great growing organic produce, but the volume isn't as massive as growing grains. I mean, all of the Dakotas are essentially planted with grains that they're growing. And just that shot was just some of the grains that we work with at the bakery, and just seeing the beauty and the diversity. They have flavor, they have different colors. It's, you know, it's amazing when people come, because most people think wheat and flour is just blah, plain. It's something that's not alive. And it actually has a whole range of flavors, like from, you know, like almost like a wheat tasting like a really sharp, like rye, to a really, really nutty and creamy variety. And that's why we like to play with the different varieties at the bakery and see. Some are really good for our pastries, some are really good for breads. That also has to do with if it's, you know, I won't go too hard or soft and all of that. The book, this picture up here, as I was doing more of my work, I had Amelia Levin, who's a food writer, come in and interview me at the bakery. And she was talking about, I was talking to her about, because I really feel like our mission is to get people to demand more varieties of wheat and to demand stone milled flour, because it's fine if as a baker I'm doing that, but I'm never going to make a really impactful change unless it's the consumers that are demanding it and trying to educate themselves, because this is something that's so important for all of us that I need like our customers to start knowing and demanding this wheat. And so Amelia was like, well, this sounds like a great cookbook. And as with most ideas, you know, and probably because I spent time a long time ago at Second City, and it was always like, just say yes. And I just said like, well, yeah, that sounds great, you know, because you never say no, and you advance it. And so I was like, well, yeah, that sounds great. I've always wanted to do a cookbook, thinking that it would just be really pretty easy. And so this cookbook spawned from Amelia basically believing that this was a great idea, and for me realizing that this is the best way to get this message across, because people, if I was going into a farmer's market or if I was going into a place, I would have no clue like what the flour would mean. And so this book was really geared towards teaching people like how to use these recipes at home and not be intimidated, and to bring baking back from a science and make it more of an art. I mean, I like to think that everybody has a story of baking with a relative. My mom makes banana bread, but she's here somewhere. She didn't like to cook, but she loved to bake. So like, it's funny that now I'm baking, because that is something that I remember my mom doing as a kid, and most people, there's a reason. It's because baking is something that really binds people together. So that's what this book is. This is just kind of like flashing for industrial farming. I mean, heritage farmers growing different varieties of wheat organically and sustainably, they use combines, but this, I actually added this in because this morning I read this article in the New York Times about soybeans, and I'm sure everybody's heard beans, and to be honest, I feel like it's a real blessing in disguise and an opportunity that we are kind of destroying the soybean economy in this country, because this article in particular talked about how North Dakota in the 1990s, 450,000 acres were planted in soybean. But by last year, 6.2 million acres of it were planted in soybean. All conventionally grown, all sprayed with insecticides, and growing soybeans is almost the same as growing wheat. And it is totally devastating to the communities, and it strips the land of everything. And now they don't have an outlet for it. And in this article, the farmer said, well, I guess we're gonna have to start trying to see if we can grow some wheat and do something with it. And so my thought is, you know, that by us not being able to sell our soybeans super cheap, that most of it's going to China, and it's for pigs, it's for animal feed. We're growing most of our grains for animal feed. And if we start looking at maybe eating less meat and more grains, that's gonna be better for us and better for the environment. And so to see North Dakota, which is amazing, beautiful, you know, it's where the bison used to roam, it's where the soil was the most fertile. To see them have to switch is something that I look at as maybe a really positive effect that'll come from this, because their soybeans are gonna rot before they can sell them. And Brazil will probably beat them out anyhow, because they have been growing more soybeans to compete with us. So these are, Julie adds pictures of the food. Because sometimes I go down my rabbit hole of talking too much about grains and the varieties. But what's really fun is that with these different varieties that you use with more whole grain in them, you can still make amazing, I mean, you guys tried the it's a brownie. I mean, who doesn't like a brownie? But then this is a scone and, you know, a brioche, and bringing back the whole diversity of what you're gonna make with your flour and that's a coffee cake with a sourdough. So that's something I kind of touched on a little bit, is like how we make our products it's really going back in time of not relying on a ton of sugar. We still use sugar, but not relying on like overdoing something with sugar and with glaze and with, you know, making things massive and huge. That's not our way. Our way is for our breads, doing it natural, and that means using a starter. And so I had mentioned about the fact that using conventional grains with all the synthetic inputs ground into it, how that's bad. The other bad thing is when you eat bread that hasn't been naturally leavened. And so I know that that might be a confusing term for a lot of people, but traditionally bread is made with instant yeast thrown into it. And then it gets mixed, and then basically maybe it'll sit for 3 hours and then get baked. Our bread is very different. Our bread, we use a starter, which it has many names: starter, sourdough, levain. It all means the same thing. It's wild yeast, and that just means it's flour and water mixed together, and then yeast is alive. It's in the flour, and it starts to bubble, look like pancakes, and it smells kind of sour. And that's what we use to leaven all of our bread. And the reason why we do that is you can't get a really long fermentation time with instant yeast. The yeast essentially, it moves too fast, it eats up all the sugars in the flour, and then it just peters out and dies. With a sourdough, you mix it with the flour and the water, and it slowly over, anywhere from 14 to 36 hours, it'll slowly break the gluten down, and it'll slowly work on the bread. And so that is probably, for people that avoid eating gluten, it'd be worth it to try the breads that we make. This means that I have to go faster. So anyhow, this is a regional guide just to show you the diversity that there's in every state, well, not every state, not a lot of southern states, unfortunately, but wheat used to be grown in all 50 states. And now it's starting to become more accessible for people. And this is a handout, I think, that we had that is growing. It's a living document, because more and more farmers are starting to build mills and build the infrastructure to supply their local economies with grain. So like in Illinois, you have there's farms that are within easy driving distance, and I like to say that it's a great way to connect your kids to the history in your area. I mean, we live in Illinois. It's where John Deere, McCormick Reaper, all of these massive farm-destroying equipment, but useful equipment was invented. So we might as well support the local farmers. And in Illinois, Janie's Organic Farm, they love to give tours. And it's so important for people to connect with their farmers and understand that. So, last slide. So this is just, I talk about the farmers, I talk about our customers, and it's honestly our employees that are so vital, because they've taken a risk to come work for us. It's not an easy job. It's very hot. It's very difficult. It's all hand mixing. And David in here, who did our dishes so graciously and helped, can tell you that it's a really hot place to work. But our employees are so dedicated and committed to what we do. And this is just kind of a fun picture of us, like Justin, who's been with me since we opened the bakery. He moved here. I have no clue why, because I didn't even really have a bakery yet. I didn't have one that he moved. But our employees that we have, most of them have been with us since we opened. And that to me is a testament that we're doing something right, because food has such high turnover. And for us, we've been really, really fortunate to keep people with us. And that's so for people that bought the cookbook, I actually think it would be really fun if you make some of the recipes to email me like a picture of it, because I would love to see. We tested it a lot, but I love to see people's interpretation of what I write, how it looks. Sometimes it's better, sometimes it's not, but I'd love to get some of your pictures. And that's it.